All right. So welcome, everyone. I'm Karen Engel. I teach at the law school, and I co-direct with Neville Hode, the Rapoport Center for Human Rights and Justice. And I'm sorry, Priscilla, you're not going to get to see all of the people I'm going to point out, but eventually you'll be able to see the audience. We have a big group here. We have 6 tables of 8 or 9, and they're all full. So there are a lot of people at the event. So I want to welcome everyone to the final event in the semester-long colloquium, the final event in this colloquium, which is also a seminar on reproductive justice, criminal law, and the carceral state. And today's event, we're happy, is also co-sponsored by the Pipeline Beyond program at Texas Law. And so it's great to have Siobhan Henderson here and some of her students in race and the law, in a course that you teach in race and the law. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the American Indian and indigenous communities who have been or become a part of the lands we call Texas, including the Alabama Coushatta, Caddo, Carrizo, Comacrudo, Coahuiltecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo. Now, this colloquium series has been sponsored by the Rapoport Center's relatively new, although I'm not going to be able to say that anymore because that was fine to say in September, but by its well-established Sissy Farenthold Reproductive Justice Defense Project. And it's great to have Blake Rocap and Christina Ramirez here, who have been so helpful with the colloquium and the seminar, coming to all the classes and meeting with the students. I want to give a special shout out to Caroline Hahn, who is our senior program coordinator at the center, for all her work. Wave. She's been here every week, you might have noticed, but this is a big end of colloquium shout out. She did all the work in coordinating the events this semester, making sure that our speakers made it here, or at least on video, and much more, including keeping us well nourished. So lastly, I want to thank the students in the seminar who are still at these 2 tables. You all have just been amazing, and I said that behind your back just a moment ago, didn't I, Christine? You've just been so carefully engaged with all the speakers' work as well as your own projects. And maybe you can get them to give you an invitation to the mini conference that we're going to hold with their work presented, which we're looking forward to. So this is not the end of the semester for them. Now, it is my honor today to welcome Professor Priscilla Ocen from Loyola Law School in LA. She is unfortunately joining us by Zoom due to an injury, but I'm excited that she's agreed to come in person and give yet another talk in the spring. It's really great to have you here, Priscilla, and I can see you quite well. So we're going to make the most of this. Her title today is Mass Incarceration and the Incapacitation of Motherhood, Reproductive Justice, and Prison Abolition as Ways Forward. And it builds on a number of different projects from which Priscilla has been engaged over the years, including a terrific piece from a few years ago in the UC Davis Law Review, which is more relevant than ever, I would say. Professor Ocen is a criminal law and reproductive justice scholar whose work, which has been published in top law journals as well as in major popular media outlets, explores the ways in which the intersection of race, gender, and class make women of color vulnerable to various forms of violence and criminalization. And of particular relevance for our discussion, I'm pretty sure, and I didn't ask you about this, Priscilla, but I'm pretty sure that she was one of the first legal scholars, maybe the first legal scholar, to write about the treatment of pregnant people in jails and prisons. And that started with some work in 2012, which has had an enormous, it's had a great impact on the academy and some in the world. And also, I would say perhaps relevant to the perspective that she'll share with us today, she recently spent time as Special Assistant Attorney General for the California Department of Justice, advising on issues of criminal reform, I assume, non-reformist reforms. So after Priscilla speaks, I'm delighted that we'll hear from Nisette Fallu, who recently joined, I think 2 years ago. This is Professor Fallou's second year here as in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies. She is a cultural anthropologist working mostly, but not only in Brazil, and at the intersections of many areas. I'll just name a few that I think are particularly relevant here: race, queer identities, gynecological health, and medicine ideology. She also teaches a course in abolitionist medicine that I want to figure out how to take. And we're really excited to have a chance to hear from her after Priscilla speaks. So with that, join me in welcoming Professor Priscilla Ocen.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I know this is like really awkward, me being up here and you being there. But I really do want to thank, and I can see you all now. That's wonderful. Hello, hello, hello. Hi. So I want to thank Professor Engel, Karen Hahn, and the rest of the center staff for inviting me and making it possible for me to participate in this colloquium and this important set of conversations remotely. I appreciate, particularly for the students, the time and care that you've taken to engage the work. And I'm especially grateful to Nisette for your willingness to come and provide remarks about your own work and also provide some feedback on areas where my own thinking can grow and expand. The project that I'm presenting today, Incapacitating Motherhood, came out of a set of experiences that made me think deeply about the gender dimensions of racialized mass incarceration. So I was visiting the California Institution for Women, or CIW for short, which is located in Chino, California, as part of a legal visit organized by the California Coalition for Women Prisoners. They're a group that's led by incarcerated women that are organizing on behalf of incarcerated women in their issues related to sentencing, to parole, to conditions of confinement. And I participated and joined them as a member of their legal visitation team as a young civil rights attorney with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights of the San Francisco Bay Area about 15 years ago. And at the time, CIW was one of the largest women's prisons in the world. And while we were being processed into the prison and standing in the sparse waiting room, folks were handing in their IDs and getting badges and being prepped to be escorted into the visitation room. I noticed a bulletin board with about 10 to 15 old, faded photos of white women with infants. The women were dressed in prison gowns and the babies were in bonnets. The photos were taken in the 1950s when CIW was first opened in another part of the state of California before it had relocated to Chino. And it housed at the time largely white women who were convicted of nonviolent felonies. These photos, with their displays of white women with smiling faces engaged in maternal bonding, stood in stark contrast to the women of color who I'd later encounter, who struggled to see their children after being caught up in the rapidly expanding prison system, where they were isolated and caged. Instead of the cold, drab visiting room, the people I spoke to asked me questions about how they could get out of this space, where they could get in touch with their children. They wanted to know about any recourse they would have for the horrific neglect they experienced, by pregnant women and the rumors of uterus stealing that circulated in the prison. I wondered what these photos suggested, the photos that I saw in that waiting room, what they suggested about the structure and purpose of this particular prison and others like it. Similar questions emerged during another visit with the California Coalition for Women Prisoners at the Valley State Prison for Women in Chowchilla, California. It's located in the middle of a largely white rural community 4 hours south of San Francisco. During these visits, I began to receive questions again about the appropriate treatment of uterine fibroids. I began to hear reports of women being coerced into undergoing sterilization. I was told stories about women who had given birth while imprisoned and were unable to determine the way that they would give birth. Instead, they were scheduled for cesarean sections, basically by surprise, without anyone present to support them or care for them as they were given birth. One woman in particular told me that she was offered a tubal ligation while she was still on the table and under sedation from a cesarean section. Some wanted to know the legality of shackling during labor and delivery. So for me, taken together, these prisons and their representation of themselves constituted a spectrum of the forms of reproductive control imposed on women on people in women's prisons, right? That it suggested that for these prisons, their purpose and structure was to promote the ideal motherhood for one set of women on the one hand, while eliminating the ability to reproduce or parent for another set of women on the other. At the time I encountered these stories and images of incarcerated motherhood in the late aughts, the United States was at the apex of its mass incarceration binge, with more than 1.6 million people in prison, including nearly 100,000 women. 70% of those women were mothers, most of those 100,000 women were of reproductive age, with Texas leading the way. According to a 2017 study of the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition, quote, "No state locks up more women than Texas, where 4 out of 5 women in state prison are mothers," end quote. As I shifted from lawyering to the academy, I looked for ways to continue the work to work with and on behalf of incarcerated women and other people in women's prisons, to understand the punitive systems confronted by women in those photos and in the visitation rooms that I encountered at CIW and at Valley State. I asked the most basic of questions, right, as I'm engaging in this inquiry. Why are we punishing women at all? And why are we punishing women or people that are housed in women's prisons in this manner? Scholars from a range of disciplines, including abolitionist geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore, argued that, quote, "For California, as for much of the United States, the purpose of prison has become incapacitation, which means, quite simply, holding convicts for the term of their sentences in such a manner that they cannot commit other crimes," end quote. Indeed, incapacitation gained currency as a justification and mechanism for punishment in the 1960s as criminologists such as James Q. Wilson and policymakers embraced the ideologies of the war on crime, which viewed rehabilitation as an ineffective means of controlling dangerous people. Instead, those folks would need to be housed or warehoused in jails, in prisons, and communities far away from urban centers to prevent additional harm, as the thinking went. This push toward incapacitation produced new and more violent forms of punishment, including 3 strikes, lengthy determinate sentences, even for nonviolent crime, like drug crimes, as well as the elimination of educational and other rehabilitative programs in prison. Incapacitation was driven by the enforcement of racial categories through things like racial profiling, broken windows policing, and the saturation of minoritized communities with law enforcement, resulting in significant increases in the prison population, with Black and Latino folks most impacted. Leftist scholars, activists, and movements criticized this turn toward incapacitation and mass incarceration. They highlighted the ways that incapacitation and incarceration reinforce existing racial hierarchies and relied on racialized notions of dangerousness that cast Black men as brutes, thugs, and super predators who could not be trusted with freedom. Instead, they needed to be incapacitated. These scholars and movements argued that the use of incapacitation was designed to police Black and brown populations, particularly men, and remove them from society as surplus population. This dominant account and these movement-based critiques, however, failed to account for the ways that incapacitation relied on gender as well as racial constructs to identify and remove deviant or dangerous people from society. The traditional narrative simply didn't fit the people I met at CIW and Valley State. Instead, the experiences of the people in these women's prisons demonstrated that incarceration not only policed the boundaries of race, it also regulated and policed the gender binary, with people who deviated from normative standards of femininity and masculinity being subject to social monitoring, harassment, and the harshest forms of punishment in women's prisons. Centering the experiences of people in women's prisons revealed the ways that prisons regulate the boundaries of those who are viewed as, quote, good women, individuals who align with traditional standards of femininity and its primary focus on motherhood, and those who did not. And motherhood is important here because it's important. It's a component of femininity that undergirded the gender division of labor and grounded women's subjugation in a system of patriarchal capitalism. These gendered cleavages were also informed by race and sexuality, as white women were viewed as traditionally feminine and Black women were not. Straight women were viewed as traditionally feminine, queer women were not, or other gender nonconforming people were not. It's unsurprising then that women's prisons were and are filled with people who are viewed as gender nonconforming and therefore doubly deviant. Deviant on the basis that they violated the law, and deviant because their identities as women lawbreakers contravene normative standards of womanhood and motherhood. This deviance is punished by targeting the thing that is viewed as the fundamental and biological basis of femininity, womanhood, and the gender binary itself, reproduction and motherhood. So I want to talk a bit about the components of the project, right? So by centering women and gender expansive people in the incapacitation framework and in my analysis of women's prisons, the racial and gender dimensions of incapacitation became legible to me, right? Revealing the ways in which policing and reproductive control became embedded in women's prisons. In my time, I wanted to discuss how prisons came to be perpetrators of gender-based violence and reproductive control over minoritized women, femmes, and gender-expansive people, how prisons came to police gender expression and punish women who failed to live up to the normative standards of, quote, good womanhood and motherhood, and then hint at what we might do about it. So first, I'll discuss the ways in which women's institutions have always been designed to police and enforce racialized gender boundaries, as they were initially conceived of as a progressive reform to protect and introduce wayward white women and girls into the cult of domesticity, how it sought to shape them into the kinds of wives and mothers who could anchor the nuclear family at the center of American society. In short, over time, prison became a mechanism for policing racialized gender norms and promoting ideals of motherhood. Second, I want to describe the ways in which this paternalistic policing of women's identities and sexualities took a particularly punitive turn as more women of color were funneled into the prison system, justified by the need to incapacitate people who were viewed as danger to society. Rather than seek to promote the performance of normative standards of womanhood and motherhood through the reform of fallen women, the prison instead was deployed to punish gender deviance and to discourage the performance of motherhood by people who were so labeled. In addition, I want to describe the ways in which incapacitation has been used to limit the reproductive capacities of people incarcerated in women's prisons and to undermine their ability to mother or parent children. Lastly, I want to discuss what I term in the paper the liberation of motherhood. And I want to suggest that we do so by moving beyond the traditional court-centered interventions that have traditionally been associated with feminist organizing around reproductive rights, or by prison advocates, prison law advocates who seek to litigate claims under the 14th or 8th Amendment to try to improve conditions of confinement in jails and prisons across the country, including women's jails and prisons. These approaches have not sufficiently protected people in incarcerated women's facilities against violence, harm, and reproductive control, right? Instead, they've made them vulnerable to continued assault, to continued violence. And instead, I want to argue that we should take on different movement-based approaches that are informed by reproductive justice and abolitionist principles. So I want to talk about this first point, right? The beginning of the women's prison and the regulation of motherhood. So the gender binary, right, the distinction between men and women, between masculinity and femininity, was a central concern that led to the creation of women's prisons and reform institutions in the late 19th and early 20th century. For most of the 18th and 19th century, criminal punishment was meted out in the form of corporal punishment, banishment, and shaming. Jails were generally used to temporarily house people arrested for crimes. Prisons tended not to exist, right? But it was only based on reform efforts coming out of, for example, Quaker communities in Pennsylvania and elsewhere, that prisons began to be developed as a reform on what were viewed as the horrific abuses of corporal punishment and shaming. So this was a reform that created the prison, an opportunity for people to ponder and to be penitent for the crimes that they had committed, hence the term penitentiary, right? But because women were generally a small population, and because they were generally subject to private punishment at the hands of their husbands or other patriarchal authorities, particularly for white women or for people that asserted ownership over them, for enslaved Black women, jails and prisons tended not to have separate areas for women. Over time, however, as urban populations expanded and women gained more autonomy over their lives, states across the country began to police and punish women who ran afoul of gender norms. Those who dressed like men, those who were out at night, those who engaged in petty hustles to survive, those who had extramarital sex or gave birth out of wedlock were routinely arrested and punished. And as Hugh Ryan notes in a really great history of New York's Women's House of Detention, as women moved into the urban center and gained the freedom of anonymity, the legal system took on, quote, the patriarchal duties of the family, the violent enforcement of virtue, chastity, femininity, submissiveness, and motherhood. These were the fallen women who violated the rules of femininity, domesticity, which included motherhood. These fallen women were initially placed in men's prisons and exposed to horrific violence and abuse. Progressive feminist reformers viewed saving these women, particularly those who were white, as one way to promote the nuclear family and to ensure that these women could appropriately take on the critical roles of wife and mother that were traditionally assigned to women. As a result, the first women's reformatory was founded in 1873, the Indiana State Reformatory for Women and Girls, and many others, including the California Institution for Women, followed suit. In these reformatories, these fallen white women were redeemed by being taught the virtues of womanhood and motherhood. They were taught sexual purity, how to perform as good wives and mothers, by being instructed on sewing, cooking, cleaning, and how to engage in appropriate hygiene. Black women and queer people, however, were not viewed as redeemable and were punished harshly as a result. Some were sent to men's prisons, others were housed in women's reformatories, but treated quite differently than their white counterparts, as they were routinely exposed to physical and sexual violence and placed in isolation to protect white women from their deviant influences. So Black women and queer women and other gender expansive people, unlike their white heterosexual gender conforming counterparts, they were not being trained to be wives and mothers because they were viewed as biologically unfit either under these prevailing views of the time to reproduce and to parent. Instead, their sexuality was punished and their reproduction was repressed. Over time, as Black, Latinx, and queer people began to be arrested, prosecuted, and incarcerated at higher rates than white women in the 1970s and beyond, this punitive orientation of the women's prison became the rule rather than the exception. Women's prisons were not a space, they were no longer a space to restore fallen women into their proper roles as wives and mothers, but instead were used as a means to ensure that those who were deemed irredeemably deviant would be incapacitated and therefore unable to express their gender identity, to mother or parent children, or to make choices about their reproductive capacities. In what I refer to as the incapacitation of motherhood, women's imprisonment evolved to become a means to suppress the reproductive capacities of women who were viewed as immoral or unfit for motherhood. So I just wanted to emphasize that. And today, those same people who were viewed as gender nonconforming, those same women who were viewed as deviant and therefore undeserving of motherhood or reproduction in the past are also the same people that populate America's women's jails and prisons. They're disproportionately Black, Indigenous, and Latinx. They are poor and disabled. They are the surplus populations that are viewed as pathological, lacking in the ability to contribute anything meaning to societies, their communities, or their families. Women's prisons, they are incarcerated, incapacitated, and prevented from reproducing or parenting children who might take on their traits. And so we hear also this sort of biologization of these criminal traits as being passed through the reproductive capacities of people in women's prisons. So in the paper, I highlight two forms of the incapacitation of motherhood in contemporary women's prisons. One I call direct and the other I call indirect. So let me talk a little bit about some of these indirect mechanisms, so some of these direct mechanisms of incapacitation, and then I'll talk about some of the indirect mechanisms of the incapacitation of motherhood. So one is sterilization, right? Sterilization, which prevents people from continuing to continue to have children if they've already had them, or preventing them from having children at all. So in the state of California, this is one of the stories that I heard when I visited Valley State Prison for Women and CIW. I heard stories of women who were being coerced into sterilizations or tricked into consenting to sterilizations or tubal ligations. In research that was done by incarcerated women themselves in partnership with an organization called Justice Now, It was found that Black trans women and women with multiple children were particularly targeted by a specific doctor at the Valley State Valley State Prison for Women for sterilization. And when this doctor was confronted by lawmakers and journalists about these sterilizations that occurred, the doctor argued that he was doing broadly a social good, right? That he was preventing these women or gender nonconforming people from having additional children and preventing the state from being responsible for those children if they ended up on welfare, right? And so this is the kind of narrative about incarcerated women that is being described and facilitated through women's prisons. And this is the kind of ideology that informs their treatment, right? This idea that they are deviant, that they will produce children that will harm society, that they will become a drain on society and or criminals themselves. And so therefore the reproduction ought to be incapacitated, their mothering or parenting abilities incarcerated along with them. Another way that the state directly incapacitates parenthood is through the termination of parental rights. For example, in states like California or elsewhere, there are timelines that have been established by something called the state law that regulates the ways in which parents are able to maintain relationships with their children, which is informed by state law. In California, parents have roughly 24 months to assert their rights to their parents, to maintain parenting plans, and to retain their rights to parent their children, to have a relationship with their children. Most women are not out within 24 months, or they're not able to obtain the kinds of courses or other kinds of programs that they need to undertake in order to maintain their parental rights. And so rights are routinely terminated as a result of women being incarcerated. And this again is informed by federal law that was pushed by Hillary Clinton that establishes these kinds of timeframes. There are prohibitions on the use of assisted reproduction. In the case that I talk about on the paper, a Ninth Circuit case called Gerber versus Hickman, the Ninth Circuit found that while there are general rules of constitutional law and constitutional principles and constitutional rights that survive incarceration, right, the right to procreate was not one of them, at least as it relates to procreation with assisted reproduction. In that case, a man who was incarcerated wanted to have a child with his partner who was not incarcerated. They had arranged to use assisted reproduction and to move his sperm outside of the prison without any need for support from the prison. And nevertheless, the prison declined or denied his request to do so, which was upheld by the Ninth Circuit. Another way that prisons routinely, indirectly incapacitate the parenting or mothering abilities of people incarcerated in women's prisons is through the routine removal of infants from people who give birth while incarcerated. In states across the country, typically once a person gives birth, the newborn infant is removed from the custody of their parent within 48 to 72 hours. This direct incapacitation of motherhood is also accomplished through the incarceration of women who use substances during pregnancy. In criminal courts across the country, there have been reports of judges sentencing women who are incarcerated, who are pregnant while facing a criminal charge, and sentencing them to prison so that they can, or jail so that they can obtain sobriety, and so that they can have healthy pregnancies for their own good, right? So this is another way in which prisons are utilized to incapacitate the reproductive choices and the mothering abilities of incarcerated people. There are also indirect ways of accomplishing the incapacitation of motherhood. So one of the things that I talked about initially is things like shackling. And this is the case in a case I discussed in the paper called Villegas versus Maricopa County, where an immigrant woman from Mexico was detained by the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department through a routine traffic stop. They determined that she was undocumented, and they took her to the local county jail. She was roughly 8 months pregnant and went into labor. During the course of her labor, she was shackled while she was beginning to labor, and she was shackled when she was transported to the hospital, and she was shackled when she got there. She later filed suit under the Eighth Amendment, arguing that this was cruel and unusual punishment. Her claim was rebuffed by the district court in Arizona. women's and other people's abilities to reproduce and to parent is also indirectly incapacitated through the denial of medical care during pregnancy. Another case that I talked about in the paper is a case called Doe versus Gustavus. We also talked about this in embodied abolition. And in this case, a woman who was giving birth was denied medical care, placed in a solitary confinement medical cell, was ignored by the nurses and other medical staff who were charged with monitoring her. And ultimately, she gave birth and delivered the child herself, all while guards and nurses stood outside, refusing to render aid. Parenthood and motherhood is also indirectly incapacitated by locating prisons away from urban centers where families reside, making it very difficult for families, particularly for children, to visit their parents, which can also have consequences for the termination of parental rights. When I visit women's prisons routinely across the country, but particularly in California, the visitation rooms are often quite empty in women's prisons. Unlike men's jails and prisons, where women often are the ones that are facilitating connection between families, but women, because often the prisons that they're located in, for example, Valley State Prison for Women located in Chowchilla, California, is located far away from places where they might reside, like in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland. And so it's difficult for their children to visit them. And their ability to parent or mother the children that they already have is restricted. Even if the children or their families are able to come visit them, prisons have imposed quite draconian visitation restrictions. Some prisons mandating, for example, Zoom visits, so that in-person visits are restricted. In a case called Overton versus Bezetta, the Supreme Court upheld a prison restriction that prohibited parents from visiting with their children if the parents' parental rights had been terminated. They found that simply writing letters would be a sufficient substitute for an in-person visit between parent and child, which seems to fly in the face of all of the attachment theories and theories that we know about child development. Parenthood is also incapacitated. Motherhood is also incapacitated indirectly through the limiting of physical contact between parents and their children, negligent or non-existent reproductive care, as well as lengthy sentences during the prime reproductive years of women or other gender-expansive people in women's prisons. Constitutional law and litigation has utterly failed to contest or to end the incapacitation of motherhood. I've cited a number of cases where the court has upheld draconian forms of reproductive violence deployed against people in women's prisons, either things like shackling, the removal of child custody or parental rights, the neglect of women who are incarcerated and while pregnant, the denial of things like healthy food or water or exercise for incarcerated people, or for the provision of reproductive care for people who are incarcerated in women's prisons more generally. And in each of these instances, sometimes courts might render a decision that is favorable to women, but they're not enforced, or they're ignored by prison officials, or courts might, in fact, side with prison officials based on the deferential posture that the court has established in cases like Turner versus Safley. So if the courts aren't a viable for securing the rights of people who are incarcerated in women's jails and prisons, if legislatures are not habitable or hospitable to the claims of incarcerated people or people who are incarcerated in women's prisons with respect to their parenting or their reproduction, then we should turn to other forms of mobilization and movement. In particular, in the paper, I signal or hint at the ways in which reproductive justice and abolition might be frameworks that can be utilized by advocates, by allies, and by incarcerated people themselves to liberate their ability to engage in parenting, motherhood, and to make full reproductive choices and to fully express their reproductive autonomy. So how might this be done, right? So in the context of abolition, right, folks like Miriam Caba or Ruth Gilmore have argued that prison abolition is fundamentally about disrupting and uprooting the conditions that give rise to prisons and policing in the first place. So if we were to do that, right, how would that look? That would mean that we would be funding healthcare, right, as a fundamental right, housing, providing basic income, ensuring that people have access to clean water and healthy food, ensuring that their children have safety when they leave their homes and go to places where they're educated or engage in extracurricular activities. We ensure that families and communities have healthy ecosystems that ensure that people can make full choices about how and to what extent they want to engage in parenting in the first place, and to give people the conditions that they need in order to thrive. But in order to do so, we have to take a full accounting of the type of investment that we have made as a society in women's prisons, right? We would need to make different choices to redirect those funds to community-based alternatives, right? There are a number of models that exist throughout the history of leftist, feminist, particularly Black feminist organizing in the United States. There's a great book by Emily Thuma that talks about some of these mobilizations, right, based on mutual aid, where organizations out of Boston, organizations out of New York would routinely organize to bring children into prisons to visit with their parents, to advocate on behalf of their parents for compassionate release or parole, to ensure that when those women or other people were released from women's prisons, that they would have housing, that they had family support, that they had access to jobs, that they had access to resources, that they had access to care. And fundamentally, that is what is needed in order to supplant the incapacitation of motherhood, is a commitment to radical care that changes how we invest, how we invest in our communities, how we understand harm as distinct from crime, right? Crime might be statutory, it might be regulatory, it might not even harm anyone other than the person who's being criminalized, whereas harm is somewhat distinct, right? And we can find other mechanisms of accountability for addressing harm in ways that doesn't reproduce the harm in the first place. And if we take up this call toward reproductive justice, which calls not only on the negative, which calls on the creation and recognition not only of negative rights like the ones that are so in the news today in terms of abortion care, right? That is, that the state should not be able to burden the right to choose, the right of women and other people capable of pregnancy to choose whether or not to carry a pregnancy to term, right? We should also be thinking about positive, right? What is it that the state owes our communities and our families? What does it owe to women who are minoritized? What does it owe to communities that are the victims of organized abandonment, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls it? If we can think about these forms of state harm and the repairs that might be necessary, if we engage in those repairs by fully funding community-based alternatives, we can truly liberate motherhood by giving people who would otherwise be targeted for incarceration and the policing of gender the tools that they need to make choices about their lives, the tools that they need to survive, and the tools that they need to live free lives in community with their families. So I'm going to stop there and turn it back over to Karen. Thank you all for your time.
Good afternoon. Thank you, first of all, Professor Priscilla Ocen, for that amazing, did I pronounce your last name correctly? Ocen?
Ocen.
Ocen.
Thank you for asking.
Yes, thank you for that amazing talk. Thank you. Well, first let me thank the Professor Karen Engel, right? Engel, and Professor Neville Hode, right, yes. Who we've only really seen each other virtually till today, so it's really good to see you, to meet you, to the Rapoport Center, to the Reproductive Justice team, so congratulations on that, and to everyone that's here. It's my pleasure to give some feedback and reflections, really, on not just Dr. Ocen's work, but also on just on these issues, right, layered at large. So much to say, it's just so much. And first of all, let me just say that though I do have a longstanding background in medicine, and now longstanding really commitment to reproductive justice in many ways through my work. The work of Professor Priscilla Ocen has definitely precedes me right in this longstanding, kind of trajectory, particularly in looking at reproductive justice and mass incarceration. And so for that, we thank you for all the knowledge that you're leaving and roadmaps you're leaving us with, and that which you're embarking on. So so let me start with first, to your point on abolition necessitates, right, a kind of uprooting the conditions that hold these systems in place, right, and what does the state owe us, right? That says really, thank you for ending there, because actually I wanted to begin by quickly, as we're thinking about what is abolition for reproductive justice, you may recall the egregious case of baby Mila. So if you don't, in February of 2023, the newborn baby at 3 weeks old, Mila, of Black parents, Rodney Jackson and Tamisa Jackson, was taken from them by Texas Department of Family and Protective Services, right, or DFPS, I think it's called, yeah, with concerns, right, of neglect after a home birth supervised and managed by a licensed family midwife, and Cheryl Annenberg, from the Afia Center, which I've yet to visit, but I have heard quite a lot about through Professor Stacy McCormick, who does a lot of work with them there. And so in March, the parents took Mila to the pediatrician, where the child was found to be jaundiced, and the parents opted to treat the child with the midwife at home rather than to admit the baby at the hospital. And so, what does the state owe us, right? Well, the Afia Center, right? They state that, and this is a quote from a news piece that was released around the time in April of 23. The doctor gave them options for care that the family agreed to follow, said Kiana Arnold, a doula and birth justice advocate with the Afia Center. And they told MBS News. Kiana Arnold further says, quote, they even agreed to connect the doctor with their midwife, but they were clear that they were keeping their baby under the midwife's care. It felt like retaliation from the doctor, end quote. And so what happens? Well, on one morning, the police, I think this is which is the police, the Denison or something police. So the police and the Dallas Child Protective Services knock on the Jackson's door, demanding to take the infant, which they do, because the physician by name of Dr. Anand Bhatt called Child Services, right, basically accusing them, right, of refusing to treat the child, right, and of neglect. And so the infant is taken immediately and pretty much held in foster care at 3 weeks old for 22 days as the Afia Center is working through these issues in trying to retrieve this baby back. And from the parents, 2 loving Black young parents who went through a very liberatory birthing process with the Afia Center and with the trust of a licensed midwife who is tied to a very established birthing center and a center that does many other things, not just birthing, is pretty much brought into question, right? And they actually also say that the Afia Center, right, it also kind of services a lot of the Black community, right? So there is an anti-Blackness that immediately is activated by both the physician, but also by the healthcare system itself, right? And the ways in which is what, right, right, Professor Priscilla is reminding us, the ways in which the judiciary system and healthcare system have always been enmeshed and entangled, right? And so, that said, just imagine, right, that a police department and child services showing up to the Jackson's home, demanding to turn this 3-week infant over to be placed in foster care, solely because, right, these Black parents cannot be trusted to ensure that their child is cared medically on their own terms. And so I'm bringing up this case because when we think about Dorothy Roberts, right, in her new book, Torn Apart, and how the child welfare system destroys Black families and how abolition can build a safer world. I got a chance to hear Dorothy Roberts speak about 2 weeks ago in New York City, where she reminds us, right, through this new book that she has out, that really, in order for us to think about abolition, for reproductive justice, we have to think about the ways in which so many systems are interconnected, right? Which is a great job that you do in your work, right? Reminding us here as well. But what does it mean, right, to think about, for example, the ways in which Black motherhood is constantly constructed, right? Not just as deviant, which I'd like to get to in a few minutes, a bit more, but the ways in which it's just constructed as punishable, right? As punishable and just punishable and as just target, right, for the kind of carceral tactics that are so interwoven, right, systemically within these kind of state-sanctioned systems, which includes the prison system, clearly, right? But child services, right, or child services, child care services. Roberts reminds us that, for example, Black children will experience child welfare investigation by the time they reach 18, and by the time they reach age 18, and about 53% of these children are removed from their homes, right? Right? I mean, like, if we sit with that, right? This is, right, of kind of not just social historical, but really also into the present, right? The ways we punish Black women, right, is by acknowledging, right, their right and capacity to be mothers, right? So right, and so that is pretty much entangled, not just in the prison system, right, but systemically, right? And all of these are interconnected, right, interconnected. I want to also think about the ways in which legislative laws across, right, the country that impact mass incarcerated Black women are intricately and intentionally tied to the legislative laws that target Black women and rip children apart, right, which you also mentioned in your work, right? So again, we see this with social services, right? But, right, this is a kind of rooted way in which children, starting with pregnancy or even before pregnancy, right, the ways in which children are torn away from their mothers, from their families, from their parents, social historically, right, the ways in which already, right, the ways in which Black children are already considered, even still today, chattel, right, for labor, right, and the prison pipeline, yes, right, but still those kind of like plantation features, right, that Catherine McKittrick talks about, right, it's pretty much the kind of the ways in which racial ideology is tracing through social historically into the present, right, of tearing children apart from their families. And so one question to you, right, out of many, is how, right, do we not just situate, but and kind of hold tightly, right? The ways in which it's much clearer, right, for us as scholars and community organizers, the ways that, particularly in the U.S. and during domestic slavery, that racial ideology and those logics, right, are kind of can be clearly traced through all the way into the present to mass incarceration, and how the Black men, right, as a Black male figure, right, kind of really clearly see that. So what would it mean to kind of situate and hold tightly the ways in which Black women, right, social historically, the ways in which enslaved Black women specifically, right, have been always regarded as punishable, right, which includes ripping their children, right, to tear children away from them, because they are chattel of the state, right, and how that is a direct pipeline, right, for women into mass incarceration, and how pregnancy, right, and motherhood is kind of entangled that. And so, and one of the reasons I'm pointing to that, and this is to my next question, right, for you, is how do we hold accountable healthcare, right? And thinking about abolitionist strategies, how do we hold accountable healthcare systems and its stakeholders, particularly in the ways in which, for example, like if we think about sexual violence in medicine, right, which is kind of my second book project, and the ways in which racial capitalism and gender domination sit at the center of concealing and protecting rape culture, right? Well, the ways, I mean, how do we even begin to think about abolition strategies for pregnancy and mass incarceration or the prison space if the healthcare system within the prison system is already, it's not even fractured, right? It's already kind of fraught with neglect and abandonment and lack of accountability for the ways in which other forms of systems within it, right, exist, such as rape culture, such as medical experimentation from the past to the present, right? The kind of obstruction racism, right, that Donna Ian Davis talks about in her work. And the ways in which also, right, Deidre Cooper Owens, right, the Black historian talks about Black women's bodies socio-historically as super bodies, right? And what that means, right, in terms of thinking about, right, that very direct connection between the racial and gendered and sexual logics within the prison system, which are intricately tied, right, to the healthcare system and judicial system, right, the ways those two are connected. So anyway, so to your other point about also the kind of non-normative bodies, I wanted to I'm thinking about the ways that Kathy Cohen, right, in her two famous articles, right, so Punk, Bodaggers, and Welfare Queen, and then also Deviance as Resistance, but specifically Punk, Bodaggers, and Welfare Queen, where what would it mean to what would it look like for us to really, in practice, not just in theory, interrogate, right, heteronormativity, and the ways in which, right, that is just another system that is complicit with anti-Blackness, right, and with gender, right, kind of the constantly of making gender, right, right, because so in my work, right, on Seam Flesh, the book that I just published, I mean, I examine the ways in which all of these three kind of coalesce together within the gynecological space for Black Brazilian women in Bahia, right? And so one thing that is always reminding me, right, my work in this book that just came out about the healthcare system, right, that these medical spaces, and much like carceral spaces, right, as hospitals or healthcare spaces in the prisons, are only a kind of microcosm of a broader social laboratory, right, which is what I talk about in my book. And we cannot look at how, where do we enter to kind of break, right, the cycle, right, of the ways in which these systems, or in uprooting these systems or breaking them, right, if we're not very clear about the ways in which they're always interconnected and how they're constantly operating together. And so, I think that in imagining like what a radical queer politics might look like, right, even for the reproductive justice system, right, the reproductive justice movement, and thinking about several Black queer reproductive justice organizers, right, they will tell us that we need an expansive reproductive justice, right? And so in the ways that Black queer, non-normative Black queer bodies in prison spaces, right, are gendered, are sexed, and immediately targeted because they themselves, their bodies are just as they're just as disposable, right, as cisgender heterosexual Black bodies, right? You still have the kind of layer in which heteronormativity works, right, operating in various ways, really, right, across different sexualities and gender. And so I think that, I think that in order to look at the inside of the system, the ways in which those working, right, on the forefront of reproductive justice, right, are today still calling for a very expansive way of enacting and practicing reproductive justice. And that really requires us to look at, as Dorothy Roberts told us, right, 2 weeks ago in her book, we need to kind of pull in, right, all of the ways in which all of these state-sanctioned systems are operating to do one thing, right, and that is to criminalize Black women and Black motherhood. And so, I'm saying this to say that, not that you're outside of that conversation, because you're not, right, but a lot of people really are, right, and a lot of people don't even know the ways in which these child services, right, systems work so insidiously, right, to rip, families apart and criminalize Black women and Black families, right, and how that's not disconnected by the ways in which, again, right, the pregnancy of mass incarcerated Black women, right, is always kind of a site of state violence. And so, I have so much more to say, but, I think maybe I can bring it in the Q&A. Yeah. I don't know if I went over time, but.